I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join us on our quest to find awe and wonder in all nature, human or wild, vast or small. A podcast in search of all that moves us beyond words. Your host for this episode is Tenery Taylor.
I've started to identify a lot more with the weedy plants, with the plants that don't belong and somehow make do where they go. Embracing migration, embracing movement, embracing not belonging.
Jessica J. Lee was raised in Canada. Her father's Welsh, her mother Taiwanese. In adulthood, she's lived in both the UK and Germany. Whatever landscape surrounds her, she's always been keen to investigate the nexus between people, plants, and place. For an immigrant or a transplant, a new landscape can disorient and make someone feel alien. I felt that myself. I grew up on the East Coast of the United States among the deciduous trees of Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania. Trees that dropped crisp leaves in blankets of amber, reds, and gold, tempting schoolchildren to bury themselves under piles of crimson. When I arrived in Seattle, fresh out of college, I was almost afraid of the towering cedars and Douglas firs that crowded out the sunlight. The constant drizzle encouraged brilliant emerald moss on really unlikely surfaces for me. Fence posts, mailboxes, roofs, all was wet and soft. Jessica Lee's immigrant parents and grandparents brought with them to Canada new interpretations of beauty. In contrast to their Canadian neighbors, they preferred different foods from different types of gardens. As Jessica became an adult, trying to figure out where she belonged, she strove to embrace new landscapes, forming a kinship with plants, with water, with nature. If she could feel at ease with the land, she could make a home for herself wherever she went. And yet, it was those weedy plants that seemed the closest kin.
I love the Rose Bay Willowherb and how it just does what it can with places where it's not expected to be. The wakame kelp that thrives wherever you stick it.
Jessica Lee is author of Dispersals on Plants, Borders, and Belonging. She also founded a literary journal called the Willowherb Review, named after this plant that is found along railway embankments, in roadside ditches. It's a plant that commonly sprouts up in disturbed soils, where there's been a mudslide, for instance, or a fire. In fact, in North America, we know it as fireweed.
This idea of a plant that is so scrappy, that is so innovative and able to really thrive in disturbance, when it's been picked up and moved, when it's been burned, when it is set into disturbed ground. It just happens to be really good at going where it wants to go and where it is not necessarily desired. And I think for me, in terms of the metaphor that serves as an immigrant, as someone whose family might be perceived as being quote unquote out of place, I think it's quite a compelling metaphor.
Even though Jessica Lee grew up in Canada, she never quite felt fully Canadian. As a child, she was enthralled with an ideal of beauty, an ideal which would become more complicated and fraught as she matured. Her story, as she'll share it with us today, resonates with the experience of many human transplants and with anyone looking to belong, especially when that person, in order to feel at home, turns to nature.
My dad had come from Wales in the early 70s because he didn't really have a lot of opportunity in the UK. He left school really young, came from a family of coal miners and laborers, and didn't really have a lot of upward mobility. And so he'd come to Canada to make a new life there. And shortly after my sister and I had been born, my grandparents, so his parents, had also moved from the UK to Canada to help out, which I will say, my dad was the oldest of 5 brothers, and I have many, many cousins who stayed in the UK. So I, in many ways, was very lucky in getting to have my grandparents close by. I spent every afternoon, essentially, in my childhood until I started, full day school with my grandparents. And they kind of just taught me everything there was to Britishness. So much so that it was the normal environment I grew up in. We would make cups of tea and we would paint watercolors of British landscapes. And my grandfather always had ridiculous and quite funny British slang, which we found really entertaining as kids. And it was like my whole childhood was in this strange bubble that was not quite Canadian. And so I grew up with a lot of things being very normal to me that were, I guess, not normal for most Canadian children. Even the way we spoke, people still tell me I say the word mustn't all the time because my nan used to say it to me when I was growing up. And people have told me, normal North American adults don't say the word mustn't all the time. So I grew up thinking certain things were normal that probably weren't.
A formative part of her childhood was painting together with her nan. Most children have done paint-by-number watercolors, which often end up in the recycle bin, or if you have trouble parting with your children's masterpieces, as I do, in some box in the attic, never to be looked at again. Jessica Lee and her grandmother produced one watercolor that actually became a family heirloom.
My grandmother also, in addition to painting really beautiful still lifes, occasionally would dabble in paint by numbers. I think probably it was an easier ask when she wanted to paint with me because I was a small child. And so one of the ones that we did one day was this, it's just like a cottage garden scene. It's just a little thatched roof cottage that sits at the end of a stone path beyond a little bridge in a garden that's filled with hollyhocks and lavender and just English country garden plants. And it was always my favorite thing we painted together. It was so beautiful. She had it above her bed for most of the rest of her life until she died, including when, she moved to a retirement home. It was above her bed there. And so it was just this important image of a kind of idealized, beautiful retreat that I think she and I both really connected with. After she died, I inherited that painting, and I've sort of moved it around with me to so many places. I've lived across the world. And when I found out I was having a daughter a few years ago, I put it above her bed.
Jessica's idealization of Britain was built on more than just a quaint scene of hollyhocks, a bridge, and a cottage, though. When she was 6, she actually visited England in person on a trip to see relatives.
I had never been before. It was my first time going. And we went pony riding on Dartmoor in the southwest of England. It was autumn and the heather was in bloom. This sort of very scrubby, it's kind of like an ankle brushing, scratchy little shrubs with little tiny bell-shaped blossoms that when they come into bloom are kind of purple, pink, russet, sometimes white, sometimes orange, ranging through all of the colors that sort of from purple to white to red in that vein. They're really, really tiny flowers, so it's one of those plants. It's through the accumulation of many blossoms through that distance. It is like this thick carpet that covers everything. Seeing it sort of a bit like an impressionist painting, that I think its beauty really, really comes to the fore.
That day spent pony riding was romantic in a dark and brooding Mr. Rochester, Jane Eyre's Mr. Rochester kind of way.
It was a really horrible day. It was raining and wet and gray, but the color, just this dark mauve carpet. I was completely entranced, so much so that, I don't remember a lot from being 6, but I remember that really distinctly. It was just beautiful.
If her Welsh grandmother helped her feel tied to Europe, Jessica's mother, who immigrated to Canada from Taiwan in the early 70s, she introduced her daughter to an Asian aesthetic.
She was in her early 20s when she moved and had no real connection to Canada. She had just finished university back in Taiwan and was suddenly in this new country where she had to learn a new language. And so I think for my mom, it was the place where she felt a little bit adrift. And that really manifested in my childhood in a search for this past landscape, this past idea of beauty that I think she'd grown up with.
So describe for us how she tried to recapture that in your backyard even.
Yeah, my mom was a very active gardener. And the big thing that she was really keen on doing was building ponds. So I remember as a child, my parents built their first pond and filled it with koi. And we would go to this garden center and my mom would buy all of these plants that would remind her of ponds and gardens back in Taiwan, and she was sort of building this space in a Canadian suburban backyard. She built these ponds everywhere she lived. So, after my parents split up and my mom moved elsewhere, when she had a backyard again, she built another pond, bigger that time. And, I think for her, this idea of building the kind of perfect garden that reminded her of Taiwan. So with koi, with certain plants that reminded her of home, and the water lilies and the waterfalls and the beautiful ornate clay urns that she would sort of dot around the garden. It was this way of weaving a thread between herself and the past.
So you're in Canada and she's putting in fish. How do they survive the winter?
Yeah, so this is, I read about this in the book as one of the sort of funnier interludes of my childhood, is that the first pond, it was not deep enough to leave the fish outside during winter. So we would all have to catch them every autumn, go out with nets and buckets, and we would bring them inside to a frankly enormous fish tank that we had in the dining room, sort of like the length of a whole person. And the fish would stay in there through the winter. And so it was always this event, the day you had to bring the fish in and then eventually bring them back out again. I loved that I had that opportunity in the winter, really, to sort of see the fish up close indoors and to look at them every day.
You have, in addition to Dispersals, you have another new book out. It's a children's book called A Garden Called Home. Now, in it, a young girl and her mom travel a long distance to what I assume is Taiwan. Will you tell us about the mother's transformation in this story?
Yeah. In the children's book, the mom really begins the story quite sad. She's missing home. She's not connecting with the place where she's living. So I sort of pictured it as the winter in Canada and how much my own mother really struggled to connect with, getting outdoors and enjoying the landscape. And then she takes her daughter back to Taiwan and introduces her to the family there and to the landscape and the plants that she's missed and the places she's really wanted to share. And it's like she becomes this other person. She's, lively and almost childlike. She shows joy and wonder in ways that the daughter has never seen before. It's a really sort of stark transition between, how the mother feels in the sort of cold Canadian winter versus how she feels back home in Taiwan. And I really wanted to sort of chart that experience of longing and how much weather and plants and place really contribute to that. So she takes her daughter to see plants that grow on the family farm. So mugwort and pigeon peas, they're all named in Chinese in the book. All of these plants that either she might have eaten as a child or they would have grown for sort of really useful functions like keeping mosquitoes away. And then probably the one that I think is most symbolic is that, she takes the daughter up into the mountains and shows her these pine trees that grow on the sides of the mountains, Taiwanese red pine. The Taiwanese red pine has these lovely long needles, finger length or longer. They're kind of wispy. And for me, the striking image of a Taiwan pine is when it grows on the mountainside, it's always the tree that's kind of reaching out. It's the one that sticks out from all the sort of scrubby green you see on the side of the mountain. It sticks out from the horizon. It leans over the edge. They're always quite daring in my experience, leaning over the edge and sort of peering over a rock face.
The Taiwanese red pine is a big tree. It can grow to over 100 feet tall, but it also plays a big role in these mountain ecosystems.
These particular plants, they play a huge role in forest succession after landslides due to earthquakes, inclement weather, typhoons and stuff in Taiwan. These pine trees are some of the first that come back to really stitch the mountain back together. The idea of pine trees being this thing that the species that are able to bring things back from the brink. So, where the whole face of a mountain has fallen away, the grasses come in and then the pines follow. And it is through their roots that stability is found again.
One idea in that children's book, the daughter is kind of like a hero of this book. She takes it on herself to teach her mom about the beauty of, if you want to say Canadian winter or this winter place, and what is happening to the landscape and why it's really beautiful. Is that autobiographical or wishful?
It's not. So this is the funny thing is that I wanted to write a story that drew on themes from my life, but that wasn't exactly my life. So the mother's hatred of winter is very much autobiographical. But I think the child's story, she goes out into the world and learns about the natural world where they live. She goes to the library. She takes out all the books. She rides her bike around, independent and brave, and learns all this stuff. And I think it's wishful, as you've said. This is the kind of kid I wish I was, and that for me was a way of, I think, giving real power and agency to a child in the story, that they could get out and learn this for themselves and find that love of the natural world for themselves.
Now, Jessica may look back fondly on the worlds that her immigrant family introduced her to. Romantic British floral landscapes, Taiwanese water gardens, mighty mountain pines. But that's not to say that she warmly embraced everything about these traditions. Take seaweed, for instance. It's important to both Taiwanese and Welsh cuisine.
I hated seaweed as a child. It sounds so terrible to say it because I love it now. I had seaweed for lunch today. But as a child, I was terrified of it. If I was swimming and it touched me, it really scared me. And I think probably many people will identify with that even still as adults. But it also led to me just really not wanting to eat it, whether down to texture or flavor. I was not interested in eating it as a child, which with a mum from Taiwan who really loved cooking with seaweed, and with Welsh grandparents who themselves, seaweed was a special thing. In Wales, people eat a food called laverbread, which is made of the same kind of seaweed that you might know from nori that's used in sushi. Those are two sort of cultural references in my family. And I was having nothing, nothing to do with it when I was growing up.
What initially changed Jessica's mind about seaweed was not getting used to the smell or taste or feel of it. It was falling in love with its color.
Well, I think being the person that I am, I'm very aesthetically motivated. I'm very much motivated by the senses and beauty. And I think at a certain point, I really wanted to connect with oceans, with the idea of being underwater, and therefore with seaweeds on a different level. I was really driven by color. When I was 11, I got sent on a summer camp on the other side of the country. And as part of that camp, we had weekends away where we would do homestays with families. And on one of these, I stayed with a family that took me crabbing outside of Vancouver. And we didn't catch anything that day. But, we spent this day out on the boat with that smell of salt and just like eating sandwiches on the boat and at the beach. And the beach was covered in just this absolutely gorgeous golden seaweed. They were like these big bands of bull kelp. They were just that caramel gold color, I would say. And they were all over the beach, and the beach was this like lovely rocky shore. You'll probably figure out quickly that I really love rocky beaches. I've never been one for, palm trees and fine sand, but, fog and rain and rock. And I think for me, it was one of those aesthetic experiences that you have that's just very formative, that somehow unfolds the kind of beauty that you didn't know you were looking for.
Jessica connects to place in a very visceral way. The color and the smells, yes, and also immersion, literal immersion in water. Now, consider this. If there's one theme we return to again and again on this show, it's the concept of awe. Many, many people express awe when they encounter water, be it in oceans, rivers, waterfalls. But interwoven with wonder in the concept of awe is the reality of terror. Water can be terrifying. We're going to hear about how Jessica learned to feel at home in places across the world by literally diving in. But she had to overcome a traumatic event in her childhood to get to the point where she could feel at home in open bodies of water. She nearly drowned in a toddler swim class at the local YMCA, and she can still remember being at the bottom of that pool.
I fell off of one of those floating foam things that, all the kids sit on, and no one spotted me for a while. And I did get rescued, and it was fine in the end, but it put me off swimming for many years. Combine that with my fear of seaweeds grabbing at my legs. I was not super excited to be swimming out in open water as a child. And it meant that I think I spent a lot of my childhood quite afraid. And, when I think of the character that I wrote into my children's book, who isn't afraid of anything, I think that speaks to what I kind of had hoped I could be like. And I didn't start swimming in open waters until I was an adult. First, when I was in university in Nova Scotia, in the Atlantic, and in lakes around Nova Scotia. One of the places I first started swimming in open water was at Crystal Crescent Beach in Nova Scotia. It's outside of Halifax, and it's this lovely turquoise beach. There are white sands there, I should say. The water is just, it's so, so clear and so turquoise and so cold that it forces you to sort of think on another scale. It focuses the mind. It narrows your attention to breathing and moving and staying moving and kind of just staying afloat. And so that for me was, I think, a really good lesson as someone who would sort of get in the water and be very afraid and start to overthink and to panic. I couldn't in those circumstances. And it really helped me, I think, root to that place and feel connected to that place and to hold my own fear. And it was, unwinding that fear until I realized that process of confronting the vastness of open water, of a lake, of an ocean, kind of unlocked something in me. It was, holding fear and awe at once. And so swimming for me has become, it's my main hobby, actually. And it's the thing that for me is the way I most connect with place, through sensory immersion, bodily immersion. Yeah.
Jessica, as she mentioned, moved from her hometown in Ontario east to Nova Scotia for college, where she learned to love cold ocean swims. Still, she found herself dreaming of the UK even further east. Maybe it was that watercolor painting with her nan that set her pining for the landscapes of Britain, or that pony ride in the heather when she was 6 years old. Or maybe that grand cultural legacy of Britain is inescapable growing up in the Commonwealth. Hey, Americans are not immune either. Think of Netflix Regency romance series Bridgerton, or the obsession with Jane Austen period movies that erupted in the 90s and has continued to percolate in theaters even in the last few years.
I grew up with this sense of Britain at the center and, Canada, other places as the periphery in some regard. And this was really reiterated, I think, in the curriculum, in the literature we read, Jane Austen and the Brontes and books like that. And I grew up reading them. And for me, at a certain point, after having had a childhood where my grandparents read me Beatrix Potter and Roald Dahl and all of these stories, I gravitated towards books like this. I gravitated towards Emily Bronte because I found beauty in the landscapes that were depicted. I was never there for the plot. I was never a Jane Austen reader, but always a Bronte reader because I was there for the landscapes. I was there for the awe and the atmosphere. And I found in those books something I could really connect with.
That emotional draw would lead her to London for graduate work in the humanities.
I ended up moving right sort of down the road from Hampstead Heath in North London, which people may have heard of. If they've seen the film Notting Hill, for example, there's a scene where Hugh Grant very famously walks across the heath. And I sort of had these cultural references for it. What I didn't realize was how much it would shape the trajectory of what I ended up studying. So I studied plants and landscape and beauty because I really wanted to understand why I had such a fixation on landscape and beauty. So I studied the history of them as part of my scholarly work. And I settled on exploring this landscape, Hampstead Heath, in part because I was fascinated by the cultural recognition that I could move from across the world and have already heard of this place and understand its sort of role in signifying beauty in the landscape.
She was attentive to the waterscape as well, as she continued to embrace this newfound love of swimming that she'd cultivated back in Nova Scotia.
When I lived in the UK, I began really unwinding, I think, a lot of that fear, swimming in a place called the Ladies' Pond on Hampstead Heath. This is like the perfect little rural idyll in the middle of the city. It's this beautiful pond. There are willow trees leaning over the side and reeds growing and flowers all around. And it's for women only. And so it feels like this cozy, lovely environment. You say hello to the lifeguards if you know them. I know all of them quite well. It feels familiar. And you swim in a little loop around this sort of mucky brown pond. And that for me was it contrasted so much with, say, the vastness of swimming in the North Atlantic, because it was the opposite of wildness, you might say. It was this really domesticated, quaint space that felt like swimming through a painting in a lot of ways. And so those were my two contrasting places and formative spaces in which I really got to grips with swimming.
Swimming in a painting sounds about as dreamy as it can get. But while Jessica's attention was often consumed with romantic landscapes, she would start to realize that embracing an ideal of beauty comes at a cost. The political upheaval of Brexit would throw the idyllic world of London upside down for Jessica Lee. She's the author of Dispersals on Plants, Borders, and Belonging. I'm Tenery Taylor. This is Constant Wonder.
I want to shine a spotlight on another incredible show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called Top of Mind, and it resonates in a big way with those who want to engage with the important, tough issues facing our communities, but who are dismayed by polarizing and divisive approaches to these issues. Each week, Top of Mind tackles one tough topic. Award-winning host Julie Rose talks with guests about complex, challenging perspectives, and the Top of Mind experience doesn't aim at persuading you to change your mind. Instead, it opens a door for empathy and clarity in the interest of becoming better citizens and kinder neighbors. Listen to Top of Mind wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.
I grew up with this really idealized perspective on what Britain was and the way it shaped my ideas of beauty, English landscape especially. And that was partly through my grandparents and through storybooks and novels and paintings. All the cultural production I sort of ingested growing up. I think in some sense I was idealizing it, of course, because as you do, life is more complex than that. For me, the thing that really hit home was after Brexit happened, and there was this enormous rise in xenophobia in Britain.
Here's PBS NewsHour from July 1st, 2016.
Just days after the British vote to leave the European Union, police in the UK announced an increase in hate crime reports against immigrants and minorities. Anti-Muslim cartoon pamphlets were distributed, and a Muslim butcher was firebombed near the city of Birmingham. On streets and public transport across the country, South Asians and other minorities are reportedly being told to, quote, go home.
Even Prime Minister David Cameron mentioned it in his first significant address to the House of Commons since the vote.
We will not stand for hate crime or these kinds of attacks. They must be stamped out.
I had been, living in Europe on my British passport for most of my adult life at that point. I felt suddenly really disconnected. And I think this is a really privileged position to be in because, of course, anyone who is a person of color, anyone who's an immigrant in Britain will know that racism, that xenophobia was always there. But to hear it so vividly articulated as we did in the past 15 years, it changed my feeling of connection to that idea of beauty. It made me feel troubled when I thought about, what is framed as the green and pleasant land in England. That's a nationalist thing, and those resonances became really uncomfortable for me. I was so fixated on one ideal of beauty that I never really took the time growing up to notice how beautiful a place I had grown up in fact. I grew up in the suburbs, so maybe that part wasn't super beautiful, but Canada itself was an incredibly beautiful country. And I think part of this is down to what got taught, right? I spent so much time studying British literature, and it wasn't until I hit university that I learned about Indigenous art in Canada, until I learned about these landscapes. Their beauty is a different kind of beauty. It represents something very different from that enclosed, safe, very cultivated beauty of the English landscape.
I want you to talk a little bit about what is the beauty of Canada as you reflect back to the landscapes of your childhood or maybe of Nova Scotia.
I grew up in Ontario for the most part, and it wasn't until I was a teenager that we started going to the region known as the Muskokas, and so lakes and rocks and granite and pine, and that really subtle beauty. My parents were immigrants to Canada. They didn't really engage with a lot of that until I was a lot older. Of course, we have those ideas of wilderness in Canada that are also really present in the States. They're also very problematic. There was a huge erasure of long-standing culture and occupation of that land and settlement of that land. But these ideals were not ideals of beauty that I think were replicated to me when I was growing up. They weren't treated as the ones to sort of valorize. I grew up with this idea of quaint fields and hedgerows and thorny bushes and little ponds and willow trees and all the things that you might see in an etching in a Beatrix Potter book. Those were the things that I grew up with as beautiful and as the nature to long for.
Jessica Lee went to England to dig deeper into the impact the British canon had had on her life. And yet, she ended up founding a journal called the Willowherb Review, which was a rejection of everything she'd been enamored of before.
It's funny, I named it the Willowherb Review because I liked the idea of naming a journal about nature and about the natural world after a plant that is often derided as a weed. And that for me felt important. The journal was to platform the work of writers of color who were doing nature writing, because for a very long time they've been generally excluded or not platformed in the nature writing space. And I think a lot of people didn't feel like it was a space for them if they came from non-white backgrounds especially. So as a space, it was really devoted to disrupting those expectations, disrupting what we might think is the ideal landscape, what we might think is the ideal nature writer, and just really playing with that.
To get a flavor of the Willowherb Review, which ran for 4 years and is now archived online, here is an excerpt from an essay written by Stephanie Krzywonos. She's a Chicana nonfiction writer from the U.S.
During a visit to Arizona, my mother wept at her mother Josefina's kitchen table because she could not get pregnant after 3 years of trying. My grandmother's neighbor, a traditional healer, walked by and heard my mother's voice breaking through her tears. The neighbor walked into the Sonoran Desert among the long-rooted mesquite trees and saguaro cacti to gather plants for tea. A few weeks after my mother drank it, she became pregnant with me. Grandma Josie grew up as the daughter of a single mother, a baker of large, chewy tortillas in the border town of Nogales in the Sonoran Desert. She told me when she was born, she had blisters on her cheeks from her mother's pregnant belly being too close to a hot stove.
Her writing is no less attuned to the natural and cultural landscape in the arid American West than was Charlotte Bronte to the windswept moors of England. In addition to her deep concern for meanings and associations found in various landscapes, Jessica Lee, as a young adult, also began to investigate more deeply the Taiwanese parts of her heritage. While she'd looked on in childhood as her mother tried to recreate the natural beauty of Taiwan by making koi ponds in suburban Ontario, other important aspects of her family's past were invisible to her. Difficult, painful stories. And she was now drawn to investigate these. Unsurprisingly for this environmental historian, one significant story hidden in her grandmother's past linked people to plants.
I sat down with my grandmother when I was in my early 20s because I had grown up with the sense that my grandmother had experienced some really difficult stuff and some really important moments in history. This is my mom's mom. She had been born in China, had grown up there, lived through the war there, and then moved to Taiwan. But no one had ever really sketched in the details for me. I had the kind of outline, just completely never colored in, and I wanted to know what that story was. My grandmother was quite a difficult woman. You could sense that there was a lot of trauma lurking in her past, and she was not really one to explain her behavior very often. And I felt like this might give me a bit of a window in. I was afraid of losing those stories before she died. And so, I sat down with my mom and a tape recorder and my grandmother. So my mom translated, and I asked my grandmother about her life, from childhood. She'd grown up very wealthy, a prestigious family in Nanjing, China. And one of the things that she had sort of unpacked for me before she had told me about everything that they lost during the Sino-Japanese War was about her family's businesses. So, they owned a candle maker, they owned, they owned property, they owned all sorts of things. But one of the things was a soy sauce factory.
As a child, was she ever on site? Did she go and visit? Did she understand how it worked?
Yeah, I think the thing that struck me the most, it was like she was transported back there in telling me about it. She would tell me about visiting and seeing just the huge jars of beans. They're like these big urns, actually quite similar to the ones my mom would garden with when I was growing up. But these huge urns that they would put out in the sun to ferment, and they'd be covered with these big heavy lids, or sometimes with just like woven lids to let them aerate, as the beans were growing mold, for example. And then as they would ferment, every so often she would get to go and peer in to see the soy sauce as it was fermenting, and it would take years. And she described just the sheer scale of them, which I think to a young girl must have been really kind of an awesome thing to behold. The way she put it was they needed 2 men to lift them up. And I remember my grandmother was very old. She was in her 80s when she told me this. She sort of held out her frail arms and sort of symbolized to me the sheer scale of these urns of beans. So it was clearly a really vivid memory for her, and a vivid memory for me to inherit.
Describe for us how soy is intertwined with your family's identity. And now it's got a kind of historical roots, but even the family that you grew up with in Ontario. For
any kid from the sort of East Asian or Southeast Asian diaspora, we ate soy in everything we had, right? Growing up, it was going for dim sum. It was the tea eggs my grandfather would make me, which are, these eggs that are steeped and brewed in a sort of soy saucy tea spiced broth. All of the food that I think was most important to me as a child, like chongfen covered in soy sauce, and we would dip spring onion pancakes in soy sauce. It was this amazing food. And, I remember drinking soy milk growing up that was fresh, warm, and the most homey thing I think I could ever think of. It had these really, idyllic and important resonances to me. Even as a child growing up in the Canadian suburbs, it meant so much to me. My mom making huge blocks of tofu in soup. All of these foods were my core memories of childhood food, I think.
A lot of times when we read about, use soy, it takes on the flavor of anything. It doesn't have its own flavor. How do you respond when you kind of read that about, Western adaptations of soy?
It makes me a little bit sad. It brings to mind for me, there's another writer, Nina Mingya-Poles, who she writes about making soy sauce pudding, and how when she was doing this, she looked up a dictionary definition of tofu, and it was sort of, a bland, tasteless food is how it was described in the dictionary, and how sad that made her. I think I really connect with that, because I think for me, there was a real value in soy as soy, not as this thing to soak up other flavors. And it commanded respect, right? Soy was a food that would give us milk. It would give us tofu for protein. It would give us soy sauce for flavor. It was this thing that was capable of so much. And I think that sort of simplification of it being this bland, very often industrial food stuff that was just there to, be filler or to take on other flavors, it was sort of missing the point in a lot of ways.
Let's talk, though, about its uses beyond being a food. There's more soy, I think, grown in the U.S. than anywhere else now. Is that true?
That is true, yeah.
Yeah, but can you kind of talk us through the last century or so of its industrial uses and how widely it's been adopted for various purposes?
Yeah, so I wanted to understand why soy has these different resonances in the West than it does, I think, to East Asian cultures. And that meant really understanding how it came to the West and how it came to be used originally. So soy, for the most part, became a heavily imported and grown crop in the beginning of the 20th century, so quite late in comparison to other crops. And it was originally brought over for processing by oil mills who were keen to use it for things like margarine and soap. And very much during the Second World War, during that period, it became the go-to oil crop because other tropical oil crops were needed for making bombs. And so soy originally in the West was not brought over with this understanding as a whole food, right? It wasn't brought over for people to eat as tofu. But I think one of the most significant parts of that is that that decision was kind of intentional. So in the early 20th century, I traced the work of one historian, Inés Prodo, who has studied European framings of soy in that early industrial period, where oil mills would create propaganda flyers. They would create brochures saying that, soy is a tasteless, bland food. You don't want to eat it. It's much better as an oil crop, because for them, if people started consuming soy as a whole food, that would require the whole bean, and then they wouldn't be able to produce their oil and the pulp, which would go to livestock feed, which would be an end to their business. So you have this cultural shaping of a narrative for what soy is in the West through people who have an invested stake in it, through oil mills.
Many people have heard of or read about health controversies surrounding eating a lot of soy. Jessica Lee approaches this topic with a lot of skepticism.
This is something that I think it really came up in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And anyone who lived through that period may remember it. These rumors that soy would give you breast cancer or contain too much estrogen. And this was one of the worst ones in the US. This was quite a popular narrative at one point, that eating soy might turn unsuspecting boys gay. These ideas, I think, became really prominent in the narrative, partly touted by dairy farmers who didn't want people suddenly consuming a lot of soy milk. But it came with these very particular resonances that soy was it was not an acceptable food, despite it being this really important thing to huge numbers of people across the world.
I was kind of startled to read about how badly you wanted to learn to make soy sauce yourself. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read your own words here, because this was unforgettable, this passage. You write, "As much as I have wanted a child or a family, I've wanted to learn to make soy sauce." Talk about why it's elevated, that desire is elevated to that level in your mind and in your heart. It's like a desire for home or something.
That's exactly it. When I found out about my family's history as soy sauce makers, it was for me one of those things that it told me about who we were, who we had been. And because of various sort of details of history, I grew up without any extended family on my mom's side. It was just my mom and her parents. And we didn't have anyone else when I was growing up. And I felt really disconnected from that side of my heritage. This piece about the kind of knowledge that making soy sauce, might return me to, it felt integral. It felt like, as much as thinking about having a home or a family are kind of forward-thinking things, that if I could learn this skill somehow that came from my past, I would understand myself a little bit better. It felt like a bodily need. Like I wanted to figure out if I had a kind of muscle memory. It was hugely important to me, just in understanding my own heritage, to know where I'd come from.
It actually takes some time, as we've heard, and a fair amount of physical space to make soy sauce. It wasn't until she was married that Jessica finally had adequate room for making her own batch.
I had to wait until we moved somewhere big enough that I could store many large jars for quite a long time. And in all the sort of small apartments I'd been living in for many years, it was not feasible. And at a certain point, my husband and I moved and we had a bigger place. And I said, okay, it's time. I'm going to do it. And yeah, I made 3 really large jars of soy sauce and I aged it for a year. It's a process about trust, honestly. You start with these boiled beans. I started with these creamy yellow soybeans, and you inoculate them with spores and with toasted wheat as well, I used. And you leave it, and you just hope after a few days that it will become encased with green mold, which took a little bit longer in my case because my kitchen was not warm enough. But once it did happen, it's they look a little bit like, like wasabi peas and that sort of dusty covering. They had that look and feel to them, and then you cover them in the brine and you let them sit, and they go from this sort of green gold color ever darker week by week by week until eventually you can't see distinct beans anymore. They've softened into this sort of mash. And by the end of that year, I think it had transitioned into that really deep, dark color we might know from soy sauce if you've had it at home. You sort of take this kind of gloopy mass and you filter it, you strain it. I weighted it down to sort of get all of the liquid out of the pulp, and it just becomes this like deep, deep brown elixir. And so it's a real transformation. And the smell was fruity, I think would be the best way to describe it. At times I was a little bit like, is this going wrong? I think with most fermentation, you get that worry from time to time. You think, is this right? But I found over time the smell mellowed out and it became more subtle and rich. And eventually it smelled exactly like soy sauce. I will say, frankly, when I finished making it after a year and I went to first taste it, I was ever so slightly terrified. I was like, what if I've made something that I'm going to poison myself with? What if I've done this wrong? But I did follow the instructions, and it was remarkable to me. I tasted it and I was like, oh, that's soy sauce. It was such a simple thing, but it was a really, a really moving moment for me.
The title of Jessica Lee's book is Dispersals. If soy has been dispersed throughout the world intentionally, the same thing cannot be said about seaweed, that plant that young Jessica was so wary of. Consider the case of wakame kelp.
Wakame kelp is native to East Asia, but it is a species that, because of shipping, because it gets into ship ballasts, after Fukushima, for example, it wound up on the U.S. shore on things like docks that floated across the ocean. It is now basically everywhere, and it is considered an invasive species in a lot of regions, particularly in Europe, where I live. But it's also really desirable for food. And so a lot of enterprising business people and conservationists have taken to harvesting it and turning it into a business, sort of seeing it from this other angle of like, this is an invasive species that we have through our own actions moved across the world, but it is also this desirable, beautiful food. So for me, I think understanding that movement and the ways in which we culturally frame seaweeds, and quite frankly, we put a lot of our own baggage onto them when we give them these labels. It's allowed me to, I think, find a bit more kinship with these plants.
In just a moment, Jessica Lee reflects on choosing to uproot from her adopted country of England and settle in a new place altogether. Can an immigrant or a transplant ever truly feel at home? And how does the landscape, the flora and fauna, connect someone to a new country? I'm Tenery Taylor, and you're listening to Constant Wonder.
I've got another podcast to recommend to you from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called The Appleseed. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories for you and your family, folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. It's ideal for road trips, bedtime, or any time you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And here's a great side effect of listening to The Appleseed. It has a nearly magical ability to conjure up a whole lot of healthy storytelling right at home, and it often prompts the sharing of precious memories as well. Be sure to catch The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.
Jessica Lee was sent to Germany on assignment during her PhD studies.
I was supposed to be here for 6 months, and I fell absolutely in love. And it was one of those things that I couldn't have planned in my life. I didn't realize that it was going to completely change my life. And of course, it's the decisions I didn't make for myself were the ones that really, really stuck. I came here and I just fell in love with the landscape. I fell in love with the lakes and with the accessibility to nature that I could have here, that sort of everyday connection with nature and beauty and with water. It wasn't possible in any other place I'd lived. In Berlin, you can hop on your bike and in 10 minutes be swimming in the middle of a lake, in the middle of the city, or even, 20 minutes longer and you're out in the middle of the countryside.
And remember when she took up a place on Hampstead Heath in graduate school? The heather of that famous heath was actually gone by then. But here in Germany, she learned about the Lüneburger Heide, a heathland in northern Germany, about 3 hours train ride from where she now lives in Berlin.
In the book, I write about wanting to seek this color, this mauve, this purple. And when I went there, it was every color I could imagine. It was orange and red and purple and gray and white. And it was just entrancing. I think for me, when I end up in front of a vast heathland or out in the middle of a lake, it's like everything else falls away. I'm in my body, and I am able in some sense to let all of that thinking that I do about what beauty means, what history means, what all of those cultural framings mean, I'm able to let them fall away and just be there, to enjoy it, to sort of take the scenery, take my immersion in that place at face value, and to really let all of those other resonances fall away. That for me, it's sensory immersion. I feel my skin and my breathing when you start to be able to hear your breath. That for me is one of those moments where I know I'm really engaged in the landscape. I hear everything so much louder, whether it's the way a tree moves in the wind or a bird, the feeling of everything underfoot, the softness of the ground. Every sense just becomes magnified. I start to sort of direct my focus towards them. It's like I'm not even in my thoughts in my head anymore, and my mind isn't wandering. I'm just there in my body, really directly.
After falling in love with Heather at age 6, here she was again, entranced by Heather, this time in Germany.
And it was remarkable to be confronted with that kind of beauty. I think I'd grown up as belonging to a specific place, but to see it elsewhere and to see that I could have that same experience of just joy and overwhelm when confronted with this really beautiful plant. And that for me was, it was a real lesson.
Your book is titled Dispersals. You talk a lot about migration. You talk about longing for a place you've never been. And you didn't even expect to end up in Germany. So can you call it home? Does it feel like home?
Yeah, I think in as much as any place can feel like home, if you're like me and you're sort of stretched across many places, yes, absolutely. It's the home that I've chosen. We have a term in German. You can call yourself like a Wahlberliner, which means a Berliner by choice, essentially. And that is a term that's often used to describe me here. I really identify with it because this is the home that I choose. There are a number of other places I could be living, but I've chosen to raise my family here and to be here. And I continue to choose that each day. And it doesn't mean to say that I will choose it forever, but for the foreseeable, absolutely, this is home. And if I left it, I would miss it enormously.
I want to know something when you walk out your door and you see something in nature, or you purposely go somewhere that helps you to make that choice every day, that helps Germany, Berlin feel like home.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big things is that Berlin is a city that is filled with linden trees. I love linden trees. And I don't write about them in the book, so it's fun to talk about them. One of my favorite trees ever, when I moved to England, on Hampstead Heath, I used to stand under this tree when I was feeling upset, going through anything difficult. It was a linden tree. They have this beautiful light green color, and their leaves are shaped like little hearts. And when the wind blows, they sort of move on their stems and sort of whip in the wind. In the summer, they get covered in sap and moisture, and they shine when the sun hits them. I think they're the most beautiful little trees with their toothed, heart-shaped leaves. That tree was hugely important to me. I had a leaf of it tattooed on my arm. And then when I moved to Berlin, I realized it was a city full of them. We have a whole street that is called Unter den Linden. It's famous for linden trees. So they're everywhere here. And that, for me, feels like this little stitch that connects me to something really important.
That little stitch. Jessica Lee feels tethered to the land and, by extension, her community, by the linden tree, by water, by Heather. And 2, wherever she lives, she's stitched her heart to her family through food, linked by seaweed and by soy. In my own experience, a place doesn't feel like home until it speaks to my past and to the present. So now, living here in Utah, I am most at ease in the mountains, where I can find the Douglas fir I eventually became quite fond of in Seattle, along with scrub oak and quaking aspen, which in autumn turns such brilliant reds and golds it can look like the mountainside is aflame. How does nature stitch your heart to your home? Jessica J. Lee is the author of Dispersals on Plants, Borders, and Belonging, and of the children's book A Garden Called Home. Excerpts from Glacial Erratic, published in the Willowherb Review, read by author Stephanie Krzywonos. This episode was produced by me with help from Audrey Hughes and Mamie Teeples. Sound design by James Call and Josh Fouts. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.